The town of Harlan Creek, Texas, in the spring of 1887, looked like a man who had decided to stop fighting but hadn't yet decided to lie down. The buildings leaned into each other along the main street, the way tired men lean against a bar, not for warmth, not for company, just because standing straight takes more out of you than it used to. The silver mine to the west had given out the previous autumn, and everyone in Harlan Creek knew it, and no one said it out loud, because saying it out loud would mean deciding what to do next, and nobody was ready for that conversation yet. The cottonwood trees along the creek had just begun to bud, pale green against a sky so blue it almost hurt to look at. Spring in West Texas arrives like an apology brief, tentative, never quite making up for what winter took. Cord Hallett stood on the station platform at 8:47 in the morning and held a folded letter in his right hand, the way a man holds something he's read so many times. The words have stopped meaning what they used to mean. He was 38 years old. He had the kind of face that had once been younger than its years, and had since overcorrected, not weathered in the romantic sense, not lined the way men in paintings are lined, but carved in the specific way that comes from carrying something heavy for a very long time, inside a body that doesn't show it, broad through the shoulders, salt and pepper hair that needed cutting a month ago, hands that were large and scarred and still hanging at his sides like tools waiting to be picked up. On the right side of his neck, just below the collar line, was a burn scar. The skin there was pale and puckered, pulled slightly tight, a landscape of old damage. He had spent 12 years making sure his collar covered it in all weather, not because he was ashamed of it exactly, but because the explaining of it would require the explaining of everything that came before it, and he had not yet found the right person to explain it to. The train was 15 minutes late. When it finally groaned to a stop at the platform, Cord folded the letter once more and put it in his breast pocket. He stood with his hat in his hand, which was more ceremony than he had intended but somehow felt necessary. Ren Calloway stepped off the third car with a brown leather valise that was too small for a woman who had traveled this far, and a look in her eyes that was older than the rest of her face. She was 22. Her hair was a dark reddish-brown, the color of old mahogany in certain light, pulled back in a low knot, with a few strands loose at her temples from the journey. Her eyes were gray, not cold. Gray, not the flat gray of gunmetal, but the gray of the sky in the hour before rain, when the light is diffuse and everything looks precisely as it is. On the first finger of her right hand, just below the knuckle, was a faint stain of blue-black ink that had not quite washed out. She stepped onto the platform and looked at the sign above the station house. She looked at it the way a person checks an address against a piece of paper, confirming something, not admiring it. Then she looked at Cord. He nodded. She nodded. Neither of them smiled because smiling would have been a kind of lie. And they had both arrived at this arrangement through honesty, or at least through the absence of pretense. He had placed an advertisement in a paper out of Pittsburgh. She had answered it. They had exchanged 4 letters. None of the letters had been warm. None of them had been dishonest either. There was a particular kind of communication possible between strangers who have nothing to lose from telling the truth, and their letters had been that kind. They walked together toward the town, the valise in her left hand, the distance between them exactly the width of people who do not yet have a language for each other. Cord took her first to Della Marsh's boarding house, not to his own place at the edge of town. He did not explain this. She did not ask. It was the kind of decision that explained itself if you paid attention. A man making sure a woman had a door she could close from her own side before she decided anything further. Della Marsh was 60 years old and had been running her boarding house for 23 of them, and she knew things about Harlan Creek and the people in it, the way a river knows its own bed, not through observation alone, but through the slow accumulation of everything that had ever passed through her. She looked at Wren Calloway for exactly 4 seconds when they came through the door, and in those 4 seconds, she took in the ink stain on the finger, the way the girl's eyes moved to the windows and the exits before they moved to the furniture, and the particular straightness of her spine. That was not pride exactly, but something closer to discipline. Then Della said, "You'll eat before you do anything else," and turned back to her kitchen. It was not a question. They ate at the long table near the window Della's biscuits and salt pork and black coffee, and Della talked about Harlan Creek in the way that people who have loved a place through its decline talk about it with a loyalty that has made peace with disappointment. The mine, the families who had left, the families who had stayed, and why, which was mostly because they had nowhere better to be and had stopped believing anywhere better existed. She mentioned Cord Hallett's name once carefully near the end of the meal. Said he had been in Harlan Creek for 12 years. Said he had come the way certain men came to certain towns, not seeking anything specific, just moving in a direction until the moving stopped. Said people thought well of him, which in Della's particular vocabulary meant that he had never given anyone a reason not to. Wren listened to all of this with her hands in her lap, and the first finger of her right hand tapped a slow, nearly silent rhythm against her thigh. It was the rhythm of a person transcribing something in their head. Cord said almost nothing during the meal. He sat at the far end of the table with his coffee and watched the window. This was something Wren would come to understand about him in the days that followed, that he listened differently than other men, with the specific attentiveness of someone who had once failed to listen carefully enough and had paid a price for it that he was still paying. After the meal, he showed her to his house at the edge of town and said she could take whatever time she needed. He said it like a man reciting something he'd prepared, not because he didn't mean it, but because he was unaccustomed to the kind of conversation that required him to articulate what he meant. The house was 2 rooms of unpainted wood. Clean, which surprised her. Not sparse in a deliberate way, but sparse in the way of a place where one person has lived alone for a long time and has not accumulated things because things require a reason, and the reason has been absent. No pictures on the walls, no curtains, no small objects that spoke of affection or sentiment. No letters kept, no mementos, no evidence of anything that had mattered to him outside the functional. Except one thing. On the kitchen shelf between the salt box and the oil lamp was a small notebook bound in brown leather. Old. The cover worn smooth along the spine. No name on the front. Wren noticed it the first time she walked past the shelf. She noticed it every time after that. She did not touch it. Cord showed her where things were, the well, the woodpile, the neighbor's pasture, where the horses were turned out in the morning. He did it with the quiet competence of a man who has explained practical things to people and found that practical explanations are the honest ones. Then he put his hat on and said he had work to get to, and went. She stood in the kitchen alone, looked at the shelf, walked away. The first 3 days settled into something that was not routine, but was the shape of a possible routine, the skeleton of a life not yet decided. Cord was up before light and gone before she came downstairs. He worked around the town the way a man without a single trade works. When the town around him is slowly dying, fixing fence for one family, pulling timber for another, doing the accumulating labor of a place whose able-bodied have mostly left. He never turned down a job and never asked for more money than was offered. And the people of Harlan Creek accepted this with the mild guilt of those who know they are receiving something they have not quite earned. Wren spent her mornings alone in the house. She was not idle. She cleaned and organized with the efficiency of someone accustomed to making order out of whatever space she was given. But in between the practical tasks, she sat at the table with paper and a pen and wrote. The pen was the source of the ink stain. She wrote carefully, and for extended periods, and when she heard Cord's boots on the porch, she gathered the pages and folded them and put them in the pocket of her skirt. In the evenings, they ate together. Cord cooked simply beans, meat, bread, and she ate without complaint, because she had come from a life where complaining about food was a luxury you had to earn, and she had not yet decided whether she had earned anything here. They talked about nothing consequential. The weather, the state of the road to the mine, a dog that had been hanging around Della's kitchen for a week. Cord said less in these conversations than Wren did, but he was present in them in a way that was difficult to describe, as if each word she said was being placed somewhere careful and would be retrieved later. On the third evening, she put down her fork and said, "You advertised for a wife, but you haven't asked me a single thing since I arrived. Not where I came from, not what I was doing before, not why I answered your advertisement." He set his spoon down. "Do you want me to ask?" She thought about it honestly. "Not yet. But I want to know why you're not asking." He was quiet for a moment. Not evasive, quiet thinking quiet, which in her experience was rarer. "Because if I ask you," he said, "you'll ask me back." The silence that followed had the quality of an agreement being reached without either party having to sign anything. She picked her fork back up. He picked up his spoon. They finished the meal without another word, and the absence of words was not uncomfortable, but was something else. A kind of negotiated peace between two people who had each arrived carrying things they were not ready to put down in front of a stranger. On the fourth day, Cord came home earlier than usual. She was at the table. In front of her was a small stack of letters, old ones, their envelopes soft with handling, and beside the stack a fresh sheet of paper, half covered in her careful handwriting. When she heard his boots, she placed her right hand over the fresh page, not hiding it exactly. More the way you cover something reflexively when you're not ready to explain it. Cord went to the stove for the coffee pot without looking directly at the table. But he saw the envelope on the top of the stack. He saw the name of the addressee and the town below it, Grady Falls. He poured his coffee and went to the window. She removed her hand from the page, continued writing. Neither of them said anything about what he'd seen. But Cord stood at that window for a long time after his coffee had gone cold, looking at the street outside, with the expression of a man who has noticed something he is not yet ready to account for. The fifth day was a Sunday, and Sundays in Harlan Creek were not religious occasions. so much as they were occasions of collective stillness. The town pausing to acknowledge that it was tired, which was something it could only admit when the week's work was done. In the afternoon, Cord went to check on his horse in the small corral behind the house. He came back to find Wren standing at the corral fence, with her hand extended toward the horse, a gray gelding named nothing in particular. 17 hands with the specific temperament of an animal that has been handled by men who were not paying attention and has formed a permanent opinion about it. He stopped in the doorway and watched. The horse came forward to sniff her hand. Then it decided against the whole enterprise and shied back, and Wren took a step toward it, which was exactly the wrong thing to do, and the horse made this known clearly and efficiently. The result was that Wren sat down in the dust of the corral without having chosen to do so. She sat there for a moment looking up at the horse. The horse looked down at her with an expression that horses do not technically have, but which this particular horse had mastered. Cord exhaled through his nose. It was not quite a laugh. It was the sound of something in him briefly unclenching, a sound so small and so unfamiliar coming from him that it might have passed unnoticed. But she noticed. She looked at him from the dust. "You just laughed at me." "I didn't laugh. Something in your face laughed." "That's not—" He paused. That was not laughter. It was the shape of laughter. He walked into the corral and extended his hand to help her up. She took it, stood, and spent a moment dusting her skirt with the matter-of-fact efficiency of someone who has fallen in the dirt before and understands it as a condition of living rather than an event. "Teach me how to talk to that horse," she said. "Horses don't tell me horses don't listen. That horse has opinions. I want to understand them." He looked at her, then at the horse. Then he said, "Come here," and moved to the side of the animal, and spent the next hour showing her not how to ride, but how to make herself known to something that had every reason not to trust her yet. He stood close enough to correct her without touching her, unnecessarily. He spoke in the low, unhurried voice he used with the horse, a voice she had not heard him use with people before, softer, and somehow more direct. She paid attention the way she paid attention to everything completely, without the performance of attentiveness that some people mistake for the thing itself. At one point, the horse pressed its nose into the curve of her shoulder, and she went still, and Cord said quietly, "Don't move." And she didn't, and the horse breathed against her neck and decided in the way that horses decide things that she was probably acceptable. She let out a breath. "What did I do right?" she asked. "You stopped trying to convince it." She turned that over in her mind without responding. When the lights started to go gold and long, they went inside, and Cord made supper. And there was something different in the kitchen that evening. Not warmth exactly, because warmth takes longer and means more, but something that had been absent before and was now faintly present. The way the temperature of a room changes when someone has recently been alive in it. She asked him that evening over the beans how he had learned to work with horses like that. He said he'd had time to figure it out. She asked what he'd done before in the time before Harlan Creek. He said he'd moved around. She looked at him with the patience of someone who has learned that pushing a door makes it close faster. "That's not an answer," she said, but she said it without accusation as a simple statement of fact. "I know," he said. She let it go, But later that night, when she was washing the dishes and he was at the table with a piece of harness leather, he was mending, she said, without looking at him. The things a person won't say about themselves are as much of them as the things they will. He worked the leather for a moment. Is that a warning? No, she said. Just something I've noticed. He set the leather down, looked at the table. Then he said in a voice that was quieter than his usual quietness, I did something I can't undo, a long time ago. Everything after that has been figuring out how to carry it. She finished the dish she was washing and set it on the shelf. She did not tell him she was sorry because she didn't know yet whether to be. And she was not the kind of person to offer comfort before she understood what she was comforting. She said, most people who tell me something like that tell me because they want me to say it wasn't that bad. I'm not saying it, so you'll tell me that. Then why are you saying it? He picked up the harness leather again. His hands moved over it without purpose for a moment. Because you're going to find out something eventually, he said. And I'd rather you heard it from the direction of something honest. The lamp on the table between them made the shadows move when the draft came under the door. Outside, a dog barked twice and then stopped. The night in Harlan Creek was the specific dark of a place far from city light complete, indifferent, enormous. She dried her hands on the cloth beside the basin, turned around, leaned her back against the counter, and looked at him across the kitchen. I'm not going anywhere yet, she said. It was not a declaration of loyalty. It was something more practical. A statement of current fact offered without promise of permanence, which in that moment was worth more than any promise would have been. He looked at her. She looked at him. Then she said goodnight and went upstairs, and he sat alone with the lamp and the harness leather and the sound of the night outside, and the notebook on the kitchen shelf sat where it had always sat, between the salt box and the oil lamp in the particular silence of things that are waiting. On the 7th day toward late afternoon, a man rode into Harlan Creek on a gray-white horse and dismounted in front of Della Marsh's boarding house with the calm of someone who had arrived exactly where he intended. He was 41 years old. His name was August Price. He was broad through the chest, with a face that had the quality of a landscape seen from a distance, not unkind, not hostile, but too far away to read without effort. He wore his coat unbuttoned despite the chill, and moved with the particular economy of a man who has learned not to waste energy on things that are not immediately in front of him. Della took his money and his name and showed him to a room, and within an hour she knew, because she always knew that August Price was not a man passing through. He had paid for a week in advance. Men who are passing through pay for one night at a time. Cord was coming back from the north end of town with timber dust still on his coat when he saw August across the width of the main street. He stopped walking. It was not the stop of a man who has seen a stranger. It was the specific stop of a man who has seen someone he has spent a long time not seeing, the involuntary seizing of a body that recognizes a face before the mind has quite caught up with what recognition means. August looked at him from across the street. He stood with his thumbs hooked in his belt, and his weight settled back slightly. A posture that communicated neither threat nor welcome, only acknowledgement. The acknowledgement of two men who share something that has not been spoken about in a very long time. He nodded. Once, slowly. Cord did not nod back. He held August's gaze for 3 seconds, long enough that it was not avoidance, not quite long enough to be a response, and then continued walking. His pace did not change. His breathing did not change. But as he rounded the corner toward his house, his right hand, which had been swinging at his side, dropped to rest at his hip, close to where a weapon would have been if he'd been wearing one. He was not wearing one. But the hand remembered anyway. That evening at supper, Wren noticed that Cord did not talk. Not the usual kind of not talking which had a quality of contained presence. He was there attending simply without words. This was different. This was an absence. He sat across from her and answered when she spoke and ate what was on his plate. But behind his eyes, something was occupied, turning something over, examining it from angles. She did not ask. She filed it under the category of things she did not yet have enough information to ask about, which was a category she maintained carefully, adding to it and subtracting from it, as she learned more about what questions meant in this particular house. After supper, when she was banking the stove for the night, and he had gone to check the horse before bed, which he did every evening, a ritual she had come to recognize as the last thing he did, before allowing himself to stop, she stood alone in the kitchen. The lamp was still burning on the shelf. Its light reached the salt box, reached the leather spine of the notebook beside it. She stood at the sink with a dish in her hands and looked at the notebook. The way a person looks at a door they have decided not to open, not because they don't want to know what's on the other side, but because they understand that knowing changes things, and they are not ready to be changed yet. Then she crossed to the shelf. She lifted the notebook. She stood there with it in her hands for a moment. The leather was warm from being near the lamp. The spine cracked very slightly when she opened the cover. The sound of something that had not been opened in a long time. Inside the front cover, in handwriting that was not decorative but was precise, the handwriting of someone who had taught themselves to write as an adult and had taken it seriously, were 3 words above a date. Fort Cassidy, 1871. She read those 4 words and did not move. She read them again. Outside, she heard his boots on the porch steps. She closed the notebook. She placed it back on the shelf precisely where it had been, at the same angle, the same distance from the salt box. She was at the sink with the dish in her hands when the door opened and her back was to him, and her face was to the window, and the window was dark and gave back nothing. "Good night," she said without turning around. "Good night," he said. She listened to him cross the kitchen and go up the stairs. And then she stood very still in the silence below, with the lamp and the shelf and the notebook and the name of a place she had heard before said in other contexts, in other voices, in the particular way that certain places get spoken about when people are trying to say something that happened there without saying it directly. Fort Cassidy. She set the dish on the shelf, dried her hands, turned off the lamp, and in the darkness of the kitchen, with only the faint light from the window and the dying warmth of the stove, she stood for a moment with the whole changed weight of what she now did not yet fully know, but had begun to suspect. Stood with it the way you stand with something too large to carry and too important to put down. Then she went upstairs, and the night closed over Harlan Creek, and the cottonwoods along the creek were still, and the stars were the enormous, indifferent stars of West Texas. And somewhere across town, in a room at Della Marsh's boarding house, a man named August Price sat in a chair by the window and did not sleep either. She did not sleep for a long time. Not because of fear. She had lived with fear long enough to know its particular weight, the way it sits at the base of the throat and makes the act of swallowing conscious. This was something quieter and more disorienting, the feeling of a landscape she thought she understood, shifting slightly underfoot. Not collapsing, but rearranging so that the distances between things were no longer what she had calculated them to be. She knew those words. She had been 6 years old in 1871, but she had retained everything that the adults around her believed she was too young to understand. The knowledge had lived inside her for 16 years without a place to rest. Fort Cassidy was the name of the thing that had taken something from her. And now it was written in the handwriting of the man sleeping in the room above her. And she did not yet know what that meant. And she would not allow herself to decide until she did. She closed her eyes. Eventually, she slept. In the morning, she came downstairs before him. She put water on the stove. She measured the coffee. She added, as she had seen him do it, a small pinch of salt to the grounds before the water went through. A thing she had noticed him do on the second morning and had not remarked upon, because it seemed private, the small, irrational rituals by which people make their days recognizable to themselves. When he came down the stairs, the coffee was already on the table. He stopped at the bottom step. She was standing at the window with her own cup looking out at the street, her back to him. "You're up early," he said. "Couldn't sleep. You want to leave at 8? A pause. 8 is fine. She turned around and looked at him directly, the way she always looked at things she was trying to understand. Completely. Without the social softening that makes people more comfortable and less legible. He looked back at her. She could see him reading her face for something and not finding whatever he was looking for, which was precisely what she intended. "I'll be ready," she said, and turned back to the window. He sat down and drank his coffee and said nothing more, and she could feel him behind her in the room. The weight of his attention, his particular quality of watchfulness, and she understood in a way she had not understood the day before, that this quality of watchfulness in him was not natural. It was acquired. It was the watchfulness of someone who had learned at some specific moment, and at significant cost, that paying attention was not optional. The second week in Harlan Creek had a different texture than the first. The first week had been the texture of mutual assessment. Two people circling at a careful distance, mapping the other's habits and silences, establishing what kind of space was available and what kind was occupied. The second week was something else. The map had been partly drawn, and now they were living inside it, which required a different kind of navigation. Cord continued his work around town. The days were getting longer, and there was always something that needed doing in a place whose population had shrunk below the level where maintenance could be shared out properly. Always a fence that had given up a roof that had decided to let the weather in a wagon wheel that had stopped cooperating. But in the evenings now there was a slight shift. He came home and she was often in the kitchen, and there was food on the stove. Not because he had asked her to cook and not because she had decided it was her role, but because cooking gave her something to do with her hands while she thought, and she needed to think, and the evenings were the time she had for it. They talked more, differently. Not about large things, nothing that touched the territory they had mutually agreed to leave untouched, but about the town, about the people they had each separately come to know, about the small dramas of a community contracting. A family that had decided to leave for California. A dispute between two men over a water right that had been theoretical when there were enough people to matter and had now become urgent because there were so few left. The dog that had been haunting Della's kitchen for 2 weeks and had finally been given a name by Della's youngest nephew, who was 7, and had named it Senator, which Cord said was the most accurate name for a dog he'd ever heard. She laughed at that. It was the first time he'd heard her laugh a short, genuine sound unperformed, which she seemed faintly surprised by herself, as if laughter were a reflex. She'd let atrophy and it had activated without warning. He didn't remark on it, but something in his posture very slightly changed. On a Wednesday morning of the second week, she helped Della in the boarding house kitchen for the first time. Della had asked her directly, which meant Wren understood she was being offered something as well as asked for something. She spent 3 hours there, helping with bread and the massive pot of beans that Della kept going on the back burner for whoever needed feeding. And in those 3 hours, Della told her things about Harlan Creek that Cord would not have told her, and that she would not have found out by other means. The mine, the original families, who had stayed and why. The particular way a town's character is shaped by which people leave and which people remain. She mentioned Cord Hallett twice, both times carefully with the precision of a woman who knows exactly which word she is choosing and why. The first time she said that he had come to Harlan Creek in 1875 with nothing she could see and had stayed because, as far as she could tell, staying somewhere long enough to be known by name was the closest thing to belonging that he would allow himself. The second time she said very quietly while she was kneading bread and not looking at Wren. He was somewhere else before, a year, maybe more after the war ended for him. Nobody knows where. He doesn't volunteer it, and people here learn not to ask because men who come from that kind of silence have usually earned the right to it. Wren was sorting dried beans at the table. Her hands continued their work. "What war?" she said. "The Indian campaigns out west." He was infantry, I think, or near enough. Della's hands worked the dough steadily. There were a lot of men came back from that carrying things they didn't have words for. Some of them found the words eventually. Some of them didn't. Wren thought about the notebook between the salt box and the lamp. She thought about handwriting pressed into a page with the force of a man who is trying to make something true by writing it down. She said, "He's a hard man to know." "Yes," said Della. And then, after a moment, "But I've found that the hard ones are usually hard because what's underneath isn't hard at all." That afternoon, coming back from Della's, Wren walked past the saloon at the north end of town and saw August Price through the window. He was sitting at a table alone with a glass of something light-colored, not drinking it so much as using it as an excuse to sit in a place where sitting was acceptable. He was facing the door, which she would come to understand was a habit of his, always facing the door, always knowing where the exit was and when. She passed the window. He looked at her with the neutral attention of a man cataloging information he might need later. She did not break stride, but she thought about the way Cord had stopped walking when he saw this man across the street, the specific stop of recognition, the hand that had moved toward his hip, the silence at supper that evening that had not been his usual silence. She began to pay attention to August Price. 2 days later, she was near the corral behind the house in the early afternoon, talking to the gray horse in the low, unhurried way Cord had shown her, not asking it for anything, just making herself known, establishing the fact of her presence as a neutral, and continuing quantity when she heard voices from inside the stable. She did not move closer. She did not need to. The stable walls were old board and batten with gaps enough that sound passed through them without significant reduction. August Price's voice, which she had not heard speak at length before, was even and measured the voice of a man who had learned to say difficult things without inflection. "I'm not here to make trouble for you." Cord's voice, which she knew well enough now to read its registers, was at its flattest. The register she associated with things he was holding very still. "Then what are you here for?" "Someone's been pulling on the Fort Cassidy files. Not Army. Private. A man named Doane." A pause. "Fletcher Doane." "The same." Silence for a moment. "He's not after me specifically," August said. "He's pulling names. Everyone who was there. Anyone still breathing who can testify to anything. He's building something I don't know yet what he's building it for, but the kind of men who buy what he sells, they don't buy it for good reasons." "When?" "Recent. Past 2 months. I came to tell you because..." A pause. "Because I owe you that much. That's all." Cord said nothing for a long moment. Then, the woman. "What about her?" "She doesn't know anything." August's silence had a texture to it. Not agreement exactly, but the restraint of a man who has a response and is deciding whether it belongs in this conversation. "You sure about that?" he said finally. "Yes," Cord said. The word came out flat and certain, and Wren, standing outside the stable with her hand on the gray horse's neck, understood for the first time. That certainty about a thing and the truth of that thing were sometimes not the same. She remained very still until she heard August's footsteps crossing the stable floor toward the far door. And then she continued talking to the horse in the low, steady voice Cord had taught her. And the horse pressed its nose against her shoulder, and she stood there in the afternoon light, with her heart doing something complicated and quiet in her chest. That evening, Cord was at the table mending a piece of leather harness, a thing he did in the evenings. Sometimes the methodical work of his hands, while his mind was elsewhere, when Wren came in from outside and sat down across from him. She had been sitting for a moment before she spoke. "You work like you're praying," she said. He looked up. "Something my father used to say. When a man works with his hands the way you do, not making something new, just keeping things from falling apart, it looks like penance." He set the leather down slowly. "Was your father a religious man?" "No," she said. That's why it was an interesting thing for him to say. She folded her hands on the table. Outside, the wind had picked up as it did most evenings in West Texas, coming down off the high ground and moving through the town with the indifferent energy of a thing that belongs to no one and is going nowhere specific. "Tell me about before," she said. Not accusatory, not a demand. In the same tone she used when she was genuinely curious, which was a tone without performance in it. Before what? Before here. Before Harlan Creek. Before 1875. He looked at the table. Wren, you said you'd done something you couldn't undo. You said it so I'd hear it coming from the direction of honesty. She was very still. I'm telling you, I'm ready to hear more of it, more. He was quiet for a long time. The lamp between them made a small sound, the wick adjusting the flame, finding a new equilibrium, a thing that happens constantly and is never noticed. I was in the army, he said. After the war, after the main war, they kept some of us on. Out west. Campaigns against the tribes. I was 22 years old, and I believed that following an order meant you weren't responsible for it. And I held that belief as long as I could. Because the alternative was understanding what I was actually doing. He stopped. She waited. In April of 1871, we were sent to an encampment on the high plateau. The orders were... He stopped again, picked up the leather, set it down. The orders were what the orders were. I followed them. There was a man who came out of one of the shelters when we came in. He was not armed. His hands were open. He was trying to speak, and none of us could understand what he was saying, and His voice stopped. The lamp, the wind. I shot him, he said. I knew before I pulled the trigger that he was not a threat. I shot him because I had an order, and because I was afraid not to, and because I was 22 years old. And I had made my peace with not understanding what I was doing. And the only way to maintain that peace was to keep moving forward. He looked at his hands. The peace didn't hold. It took another 4 years for it to fully come apart. And by the time it did, I was somewhere in New Mexico that I had no reason to be. And I stayed there until I couldn't stay there anymore. And then I came here. The room held his words for a moment. Wren sat across from him and looked at his face, not at what she could read in it, but at the face itself, the specific topography of a man who had just said the true thing, for the first time in longer than she could calculate, and who had said it without asking for anything on the other side of it. She thought about a man standing outside a shelter with his hands open. She thought about what a 6-year-old girl remembers and what she doesn't, and what a 12-year-old boy remembers and carries forward into a body that becomes a man who gets sick in a town called Grady Falls. She thought about all of this and kept it exactly where it was, inside her, held still, because this was not the moment. The moment would come. But this was not it. This was the moment where he had said the true thing, and the true thing required something from her that was not a revelation. You came here and you stayed, she said. 12 years. Yes. Why here specifically? He looked up. It was far enough from everywhere I'd been, he said, and small enough that there was always something that needed doing. I found that if I kept doing the things that needed doing, I could get through a day. And then another one. She nodded slowly. That's not nothing, she said. No, he said, but it's not enough either. No, she agreed. It's not. They sat with that for a moment, the honest assessment of a thing that was true and insufficient, which is a rarer kind of honesty than either false comfort or dramatic self-condemnation. Then she stood up and said she was going to get some air, and she went outside. She walked around the side of the house to the narrow strip of ground between the wall and the fence, where a single old post oak had somehow established itself in the dry soil and grown to a height that seemed improbable, given everything working against it. She stood beneath it with her back against the rough bark and tipped her head back and looked up through the new leaves at the enormous sky. And then, alone in the dark between the house and the fence, she cried. Not loudly. Not with any of the dramatics that the moment might have seemed to call for. She stood against the post oak and let her eyes run and pressed the back of her hand against her mouth and breathed through it, because there are griefs that require privacy, not because they are shameful, but because they are too large and too particular to be witnessed. And this was that kind. She cried for her father, who had stood with his hands open and had been killed before he finished whatever sentence he had been trying to say. She cried for the years between that moment and this one, which had been years of not having enough information to know where to put the grief, and then having too much. She cried because this morning she had put salt in his coffee without being asked to, and because that small thing now felt like something she needed to mourn, though she could not have explained to anyone why. She cried for approximately 15 minutes. Then she dried her face with her sleeve, breathed in, breathed out, felt the bark of the post oak against her back real rough present. She went back inside. He was still at the table. He looked up when she came in and she met his eyes. And her face was the face she intended it to be. She had washed it at the pump before coming in, which had taken 30 seconds and was worth every one of them. "I'm going to sleep," she said. "I'll make breakfast." "You don't have—" "I know I don't have to," she said. "I'll make it anyway." She went upstairs. He sat at the table for a long time after she'd gone up with the harness leather and the lamp, and the sound of her moving around in the room above him. The specific sounds of a person who is settling into a space, who has learned its dimensions and is moving inside them without having to think about where the edges are. He picked up the harness leather, set it down, looked at the shelf. The notebook was exactly where it always was. He sat with the specific stillness of a man who has said the thing he has never said and is waiting to understand what that means. Not from anyone else, just from the fact of having said it. From the way the air in the room feels different when something that has been held for a long time is finally let out even slightly, even partially. Outside, the wind moved through the cottonwoods. He sat there until the lamp guttered. Then he went to bed. 3 days before they left for Grady Falls, a letter arrived for Wren. She was at Della's when it came, and Cord was the one who took it in from the post rider and set it on the table without opening it, which was an obvious thing to do, and which she nonetheless noted when she came in and found it there, noted the fact that it was exactly as it had arrived undisturbed. She picked it up. The postmark was Grady Falls. The handwriting on the outside was not strong a person writing carefully, because the ordinary force was not available to them. She read it standing at the table, and Cord, coming in from the back with water for the stove, saw her face. He had not seen her face do this before. She controlled her expressions with a consistency that spoke of long practice, but something in this letter got underneath it. Not dramatically, not with visible anguish, but the way cold gets underneath a coat. A slight total change in the quality of stillness. He set the water down and waited. After a moment, she lowered the letter. "My brother," she said. "He's still in Grady Falls." She folded the letter along its existing creases. "He's been ill. Since the winter." She paused. "The letter says I should come." Cord stood in the kitchen doorway. She looked at him, not asking, telling him something she had decided he needed to know, which was different. "Grady Falls is 4 days' ride," she said. "I can make it in 5 alone if I'm careful. You'd go through the Reeves Flat alone. I've navigated worse." "That's not—" He stopped, considered. "I'll take you." She looked at him. "You don't have to. I have business in that direction." The silence between them was very short, but she filled it correctly. "You don't have business in that direction," she said. He held her gaze. "No," he said, "I don't." She folded the letter once more and put it in her skirt pocket, stood there, with her hand still over it for a moment. The flat of her palm against the outside of the pocket, the small weight of what it contained. "All right," she said. They left at 8 the following morning. Della came to the gate of the boarding house as they rode past. She looked at Wren on the borrowed bay mare, and then at Cord on the gray, and her face did what it did when she was understanding something that she was gonna hold privately without comment. She raised a hand. They both raised theirs. Then Harlan Creek was behind them, and the road opened out into the long brown country of West Texas. Flat on the east, and rising slowly toward the Reeves Flat to the west. The sky enormous in all directions, and the light still cool and horizontal from the morning. They rode without talking for the first hour. Not the silence of estrangement, the silence of people who have reached a point where silence is not avoidance, but the natural condition of moving through a large landscape together. The horses set their own pace, a comfortable walk that covered ground without urgency, and the country moved past them with the gradual quality of large spaces. Around mid-morning, she said, "How old were you when you went into the army?" 19, Chiat, he said. "The main war was almost over. I came in at the end of it and stayed on for the campaigns after." "Did you want to—" He thought about this seriously. "I didn't have a strong enough idea of what I wanted to do otherwise," he said. "And the Army tells you what to want. That's most of its appeal for men who don't know yet. And when you stop being able to follow that—" "When I stopped being able to follow it," he said, "I didn't know what I was instead." She rode beside him with her hands easy on the reins, the bay mare having decided she was acceptable in the way that horses decide things slowly and without announcement. "My father was a man who knew what he wanted," she said, not as a response to what he'd said exactly, more as something she decided to say while it was available to her. He wanted a place to farm and a family to farm it with. That was the complete list. He didn't want anything that wasn't on the list. Where was this West Texas, high plateau country before? She stopped. "When I was small." The road curved around a dry wash and then straightened again. A hawk moved in a slow circle overhead, riding the late morning thermals with the patient efficiency of something that doesn't need to hurry. Cord did not ask what she had stopped before saying. He had learned her silences well enough by now to know the difference between the kind that were finished and the kind that were only paused. They made camp that first evening against a sandstone outcropping that cut the wind from the northwest and held the warmth of the afternoon sun longer than the open ground. Cord built a fire with the efficiency of a man who has done it in worse conditions with less to work with, and she set up the provisions she'd packed with an equal economy of motion, and they ate cornbread and dried beef while the sky above them went from blue to green to the particular deep purple-black of a desert night, unpolluted by anything human. The stars came out the way they always came out in that country all at once, as if they had been waiting just behind the daylight and were released when the last of it went. She looked up at them for a while. "Elliot," she said, the name she had not used before in front of him. "Your brother. He was 12 when we were separated. I was 6. She kept her eyes on the sky. He remembered more than I did. He had more to carry." Cord was quiet. "I spent 10 years trying to find where he'd ended up," she said. "Writing letters, asking people. Most people didn't know or didn't say. 4 months ago, someone finally wrote back from Grady Falls." She paused. "I had enough saved for a train ticket as far as Pittsburgh. I found your advertisement in a paper there." Cord looked at the fire. "You came to Harlan Creek because it was 4 days from Grady Falls," he said. "Yes." "The advertisement was a way to make the journey make sense and to have somewhere to be while I figured out the rest." She said it without apology, as a statement of the mechanics of a decision made with limited resources. "I want you to know that. I'm not telling you to be unkind. I'm telling you because you told me the truth, and it would be dishonest not to." He nodded. The fire made its small sounds between them. "I figured something like that," he said. "Did you?" "Not the specifics. But I knew you had a reason for coming that wasn't me." He picked up a stick and turned it in the edge of the fire, watching the end of it begin to catch. "I don't say that unkindly either." She looked at him then. "Then why did you put the advertisement in?" He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer. "Because I had been alone with it for 12 years, he said. And I understood that being alone with it for 12 more was going to finish something in me that wasn't finished yet. I didn't think I deserved a family. I thought maybe if someone was there, if someone was in the house at the table, I would be less able to give myself permission to forget. That I would have to keep being a person accountable to something." She turned that over carefully. "That's a strange reason to take a wife," she said. "I know it is. It might be the most honest reason I've ever heard, though." The stick in the fire had caught fully, and he placed it back in the center where it would burn down evenly. She looked at the sky again. "Elliot will want to know who brought me," she said. "What will you tell him?" She thought about this for a moment. Something moved across her face, not quite a smile, not quite its absence. The expression of a person who is holding more information than they are releasing and is making a deliberate choice about the ratio. "I'll tell him the truth," she said. "Eventually." The fire settled. The stars moved imperceptibly in their courses. A coyote called from somewhere to the south and was not answered. She rolled her blanket out and lay down without further ceremony, the way people sleep in open country, completely trusting that whatever needs to be faced will be there in the morning. Cord sat up for a while longer, watching the fire die down to coals. He sat with the weight of what he had said, and what she had said, and with the particular quality of this night which felt like the last night of a certain kind of ignorance, his own and perhaps hers too, though he could not have explained why he felt that, only that the feeling was there, and that it was not entirely unwelcome. He thought about Fort Cassidy. He thought about a man with open hands. He thought about the fact that somewhere ahead of them, 4 days east, there was a man named Elliot Calloway, who was 12 years old in April of 1871, and who was now sick in a room in Grady Falls, and who had been 6 years younger than his sister's age now, when everything that had connected them to each other and to their father had come apart. He sat with this for a long time. Then he lay down on his own side of the fire and closed his eyes, and above him the stars continued in their enormous silence, and the coals breathed their slow orange breath, and in the morning there would be 3 more days of road between them, and whatever was waiting in Grady Falls, and he would ride them the same as he rode everything forward, because there was no other direction that made sense anymore. The morning of the 4th day came in gray and cold, the sky the color of old pewter, the light arriving without warmth or announcement. They broke camp in silence and ate, standing the last of the cornbread cold, with water from the canteen, and were riding before the sun had fully cleared the eastern ridgeline. Wren had been quieter since the 3rd night. Not the quiet of distance, she still rode beside him, still answered when he spoke, still turned her head toward him when he said something that required a response. But there was a quality to her silence that had changed in the way that water changes when it is approaching something, a gathering, a drawing, in a concentration of direction that had not been there before. Cord noticed. He said nothing. He had learned that her silences were doing work, and that interrupting them was like pulling a stitch. They rode through the Reeves Flat in the early morning, the alkali pan gleaming white in the low light, the horses picking their way with instinctive care across the salt-crusted ground. The flat had a beauty to it that required a particular kind of patience to see. Not the beauty of something offering itself to you, but the beauty of something completely indifferent to whether you appreciated it, which was honest in a way that more conventionally beautiful landscapes were not. On the far side of the flat, the country changed. The ground rose slightly, turned redder, the scrub thickened from isolated specimens of suffering plant life to something approaching density. The sky began to show blue in the east, and then overhead, and then everywhere the pewter burning off the light, coming into its full daily amplitude. Around mid-morning she spoke. "Fort Cassidy," she said. "What was the name the man who gave the orders?" Cord's hands tightened slightly on the reins, a small adjustment barely visible. "Doane," he said. "Captain Fletcher Doane." The name moved between them and settled. "He's still alive," she said. Not a question. "As far as I know, he left the army shortly after. He has arrangements, things he buys and sells." He paused. "August came to warn me that Doane has been pulling files, records, anyone still living who was at Fort Cassidy." She absorbed this without visible reaction, which was itself a kind of reaction. the deliberate stillness of someone absorbing a blow they had partly been expecting. "He's building something," she said. "That's what August thinks." What kind of man is he? Cord thought about how to answer this honestly. "The kind," he said finally, "who understands that other people's worst moments are a resource. He doesn't threaten. He doesn't use violence if he can avoid it. He just accumulates. Things people would prefer stayed private, and then he makes arrangements." "A parasite," she said, flatly without heat. "Yes." They rode in silence for a while. Then she said, "And Elliot? Would Elliot be in his files?" The question landed with its full weight. Cord said nothing for a long moment. "Elliot Calloway," she said. 28 years old. Grady Falls, Texas. Alive. A witness. He was 12 years old in April of 1871. Old enough to remember, old enough to testify to what he saw. Her voice was level, precise. The voice of someone who has been doing arithmetic for 4 days and has arrived at the answer. If Doane is pulling names from Fort Cassidy, Elliot's name would be in those files, and Elliot's name would lead him to Grady Falls. Cord looked at the road ahead of them. "Yes," he said. "How far ahead of us could he be? If he left from the east, from wherever he operates, and Elliot's name was one of the first he found." He paused. "Possible he's already there." She looked at him. He met her eyes. In the flat, late morning light of West Texas, with the road running out ahead of them, toward something that was no longer simply a brother in a room, they looked at each other across the space between their 2 horses, and the full architecture of what had been accumulating since a Thursday morning on a station platform in a dying silver town was visible between them for the first time. Not said, not yet, but visible. She turned back to the road. "Then we ride faster," she said. They reached Grady Falls in the middle of the afternoon. It was a larger town than Harlan Creek. Not large by any generous standard, but large enough to have a hotel and 2 saloons and a doctor's office with a painted sign that had not yet fully faded. The main street ran east to west, and the afternoon light came straight down it, flat and clarifying, making everything look like itself without embellishment. Cord saw the horse first, a gray-spotted mare tied outside the smaller of the 2 saloons, a good horse, well kept, carrying expensive tack. Not the horse of a man passing through. The horse of a man who had arrived and intended to be comfortable while he stayed. He said nothing to Wren, but he had stopped scanning the street with the idle manner of someone orienting himself, and had shifted to the particular attentiveness of a man who has located the thing he was worried about and is now calculating. Elliot Calloway's house was on the south side of town, a small adobe structure with a bare yard and a woodpile stacked against the east wall, with the precise excessive care of someone who had expected to need it and had run out of the energy to use it. The garden plot beside the house had been started and then abandoned mid-season. The soil turned, but nothing in it. A horse Cord did not recognize was tied at the post outside the door. The horse was gray-spotted. He recognized it from the saloon. Wren was already dismounting. He caught her arm, not roughly a hand on her forearm, the flat of his palm enough to stop her for 1 second. "He's already here," Cord said quietly. She looked at the horse, looked at the door, "I know," she said. "Ren. He's with my brother." She pulled her arm free gently. "I'm going in." She went to the door and pushed it open without knocking because it was her brother's house, and she did not knock at her brother's house, and Cord tied both horses and followed her. The front room was small and low-ceilinged and smelled of medicine and closed air, and the specific staleness of a room where someone has been ill for a long time. There was a table with 2 chairs, a shelf with a few objects on it, a window with the curtain drawn against the afternoon heat. In one of the chairs, with a glass of water and a leather satchel open on the table beside him, sat Fletcher Doane. He was 52 years old and looked like a man who had spent that time in the specific comfort of someone who has never had to work with his body. Not fat trim, actually, in the way of a man who is careful with himself, because his body is an instrument he needs maintained. Silver hair, a suit that had been good when it was bought and was still better than anything else in this room. His hands were on the table, relaxed, a pen beside them. He looked up when they came in. He looked at Ren first with the courteous attention of a man acknowledging someone he did not expect. Then he looked at Cord, and the courteous expression held did not shift into alarm or surprise, only recalibrated like a calculation being updated with new variables. "Cord Hallett," he said. His voice was what Cord had described, light-measured, a voice that did not need to be raised because it assumed it would be listened to. "I'll confess I didn't expect you to walk in from that direction. I'll confess I don't particularly care what you expected," Cord said. Doane's gaze moved between them, settling, reassessing. And this would be... He looked at Ren with a different quality of attention now. Reading her. "You came together. From where?" "Harlan Creek," Cord said. Something moved behind Doane's eyes. A small, rapid adjustment. "Harlan Creek," he repeated. And then, very quietly, as if speaking to himself, "Well, that is a more interesting story than the one I came here for." From the back room, a voice, thin, careful. The voice of someone marshaling strength for each word, "Ren." She was through the inner doorway before the word had finished. The room beyond was small. A bed against the far wall. A window with afternoon light coming through it at a low angle, laying a stripe of gold across the floor. In the bed, propped against a folded blanket, was a man who had once been broad and was now the thinner version of that. The version that illness makes, where the bones are more apparent and the skin has lost its confidence. He was 28 years old. His hair was darker than hers, almost black, and his eyes were the same gray. He looked at her with the expression of someone who has been expecting a thing to happen and still cannot quite account for the fact that it is happening. She crossed the room and sat on the edge of the bed and took his hand in both of hers and said his name once, Elliot, and then did not say anything else, because there was nothing else to say that the room did not already contain. He looked at her face for a long moment. "You're taller," he said. "You're thinner," she said. He made a sound that was close to a laugh. In the front room, Cord stood between Doane and the inner doorway. Doane had not stood. He remained in the chair with his hands on the table, the pen beside them, the satchel open. He was the kind of man who understood that his advantage in any situation was composure, and he wore it with the ease of long practice. "Sit down, Hallett," he said. There's no reason this has to be unpleasant. I'm not interested in sitting. No. Doan looked at him with something that might have been the distant relative of respect. You never were much for the comfortable option. He picked up the pen, set it down. I'll tell you what I came here for. The boy in there. His name is Elliot Calloway. Has a memory. A clear one from what I've established. He was 12 years old, and 12-year-olds who witness significant events tend to retain them with a particular fidelity. He remembers what happened at Fort Cassidy in April of 1871. Doan's voice remained at its same measured level, as if he were discussing terms for a grain contract. That memory has value to certain parties who are currently re-examining some of the decisions made during the Indian campaigns. Not for justice. I want to be honest with you. I'm not a man who works in justice. For leverage, political, financial. The specifics would bore you. And you came here to buy his testimony, or to explain to him why providing it might be in his interest. He's ill. I had noticed. Doan's tone did not change. I was prepared to be patient. Cord looked at this man who had given orders on a plateau in Texas 16 years ago, and had spent the interval building a life from the wreckage of other people's worst moments. And he felt not anger, which was too simple and too warm, but something colder and more complete. The total clarity that comes when you see a thing precisely for what it is without the distortion of wanting it to be otherwise. There's a man named August Price, Cord said. He has documentation of what you did at Fort Cassidy, not what your infantry did. What you did personally in the 4 months after. Things that didn't make it into the official record because you made sure they didn't. He kept his voice level. He knows where Elliot Calloway lives. He'll come here eventually, or he'll send what he has to someone who will. August has been patient with that documentation for a long time. He kept it because he believed a use for it would eventually present itself. He's decided it has. Doan was very still. The room was quiet. Outside, a wagon passed on the street, its wheels loud on the dry ground. And then the sound faded and the quiet came back. Doan picked up his pen, looked at it, put it in his coat pocket. That's a significant claim, he said. Yes. You be making an enemy. You've been an enemy since 1871. I'm just acknowledging it openly. Doan sat for another moment. The calculation behind his eyes was visible not because he was careless with it, but because it was large and rapid, and even his considerable composure could not entirely contain the edges of it. He was a man who dealt in situations where the variables were in his control, and the variables here had shifted in a direction he had not prepared for. He picked up the satchel, closed it, stood. He was taller than he looked, sitting not as tall as Cord, but tall enough. And he carried himself with the specific uprightness of a man who has commanded others and expects that quality to be legible. I'll tell you something, Hallett, he said. He was moving toward the door unhurried because he was not a man who fled and would not be seen to. Everyone who was at Fort Cassidy has something they'd prefer stayed buried, including August Price. He picked up his hat from the table. Including you. The difference between you and me is that I know it's a resource and you've decided to treat it like a wound. Yes, Cord said. That's the difference. Doan looked at him for a moment. A final calibration, a man updating his files. Then he put on his hat and walked out the door without closing it behind him. And the afternoon light came in through the open door and lay across the floor of the small room, and outside there was the sound of a horse being untied and ridden away at a pace that was measured and deliberate, because Fletcher Doan was not a man who galloped away from anything. Cord stood in the open doorway and listened until the sound of the horse was gone. Then he pulled the door closed and went to the chair that Doan had vacated and sat in it. And for a moment he simply sat there, in the quiet of a room that had just been made slightly less dangerous by the departure of something genuinely dangerous, and let his hands be still on the table. From the back room he could hear Wren's voice, low, unhurried, the particular tone she used when she was telling someone something important and wanted them to have time to receive it. He could hear Elliot's voice in response, quieter, with the stops and starts of someone managing breath carefully. He did not try to hear the words. He sat in the chair and looked at the shelf on the wall. A Bible, a tin cup, a folded piece of cloth, and thought about nothing specific, which was unusual for him. He had spent 12 years in the constant low-grade company of specific thoughts, memories that arrived without invitation and required management. But in this particular moment, in this chair, in this room, he was simply present and empty and tired in a way that was almost a relief. After a while, the sound from the back room shifted, a longer silence. Then Wren appeared in the doorway. She stood there for a moment. She had been crying again, not recently. The evidence was dry, but recently enough. She looked at him with a face that was doing several things at once, none of which she was fully controlling, which was the first time he had seen her face in that condition. "He's asleep," she said. "Good." She came into the front room and sat in the other chair and put her hands flat on the table and looked at them. "He remembers," she said. "He told me what he remembers." She paused. "He remembers a soldier who stopped, who turned back when the others were going forward, who looked at him, a boy, behind a curtain, and then turned away and followed the others." Cord said nothing. "He didn't see your face. He saw your back, and he saw you stop, and he saw the posture of a man who was making a decision that cost him something. He has held on to that for 16 years. She looked up, not as a comfort, just as a true thing that happened in the middle of other things. The room was very quiet. "You stopped," she said. "It was too late. You know that. I know that. Stopping didn't undo what came before it." She looked at him with the gray eyes that were her father's eyes, that he had not known were her father's eyes until 4 days ago, and that he would know for every day after this. "But you stopped." He looked at the table. "I've asked myself," he said slowly, "for 16 years whether I stopped because something in me understood what was right, or whether I stopped because I was afraid of what I had already done and didn't want to add to it. I've never been able to tell the difference." "Maybe," she said, "it doesn't matter which one it was. Maybe what matters is that something in you, fear or conscience or whatever it was, had enough left in it to make your feet stop moving." He was quiet for a long time. "Your father," he said. The man with open hands. He was trying to speak. Yes. I didn't understand the language. I've thought about what he might have been saying. I know what he was saying, she said. Her voice was very steady. He was saying that his children were inside. He was saying, please. The word landed in the room and stayed there. Cord sat with it. He had known in some formless and unexamined way that this was what the words had been. He had not allowed it to become specific before now. Hearing it made specific in her voice, in her father's words, carried forward in her memory. He sat with it the way you sit with a weight that has finally been set down in the right place, which is not the same as being free of it, but is different from carrying it alone. I'm sorry, he said. The same words he had said 4 nights ago on the road. But they were different words now because the space between them had changed. Because she knew, and he knew she knew, and there was nothing between the words and what they meant. I heard you, she said. I heard you then. I hear you now. Not forgiveness, not absolution, a witness, the specific and irreplaceable thing of being heard by the person who had the most reason to refuse to listen. They sat in Elliot Calloway's front room as the afternoon went gold and long through the window, and neither of them spoke for a long time. And the silence was not empty but was full of everything that had passed between them over the past 2 weeks. The careful negotiations and the small honestnesses, and the coyote calling to no answer, and the salt in the coffee, and the horse pressing its nose against her shoulder, and the notebook on the shelf, and the post oak in the dark, and all of it every particular and ordinary moment of 2 people moving carefully toward each other across a very large distance. 3 days passed. Cord slept in the barn of the boarding house at the end of the street. He came each morning to the small adobe house and found things to do. Firewood needed splitting a fence post, had worked loose in the yard. The woodpile needed restacking against the south wall, where it would be better sheltered. He did these things without being asked, and without announcing them. He just did the work that was visible and needed doing, which was the only way he knew to be present in a place. Each afternoon he sat with Elliot for a while. He had not planned to. On the second day, Wren had gone to speak with the doctor, and he had been in the front room and Elliot had called from the back room, and he had gone in because there was no one else to go. Elliot Calloway was 28 years old and ill in the specific way that wears a person down to their essence, strips away the social performances and leaves the real thing underneath. He looked at Cord with his sister's gray eyes and said, without any particular ceremony, "You're the man from the advertisement." Yes. She didn't come here because of the advertisement. No, she told me. Elliot looked at him for a moment. Why are you still here then? Cord thought about this seriously, because Elliot was the kind of person who asked questions he intended to be answered seriously. Because I had a reason to leave and chose not to, he said. Elliot appeared to find this acceptable. He shifted against his blanket. She said you brought her through the Reeves Flat, he said. She hates the Reeves Flat. She told me in a letter she would go around if she had to come that way. She didn't mention that. No, Elliot said. She doesn't mention when she's afraid. She just does the thing anyway and doesn't mention it. He looked at the ceiling. She's been doing that since she was 6. Cord sat with that. On the 3rd afternoon, while Wren was in the front room writing letters at the table, Elliot asked Cord to bring him a glass of water. And when Cord brought it, Elliot held the glass with both hands and looked at him over the rim and said, "Fort Cassidy." Cord went still. "I know," Elliot said. "I've known since yesterday. She told me." He drank some water, set the glass on the small table beside the bed. "She told me because she doesn't keep things from me. That's her way." Cord stood by the window. The afternoon light came through the glass and caught the right side of his neck. The scar there, pale against his skin, visible above the collar he had not thought to adjust when he sat down. He had gotten it not at Fort Cassidy, but in the months after, in a fire he had started in a barn in New Mexico, and had not tried hard enough to leave. He had decided afterward that surviving it meant something, though he had spent years arguing with himself about what. "I'm not going to ask you to explain yourself," Elliot said. "I was 12. I've had 16 years to think about what I do and don't understand about that day, and there are things I understand and things I don't, and I've made peace with the ones I don't." He looked at Cord. "What I want to tell you is that I remember you stopped. I know why that matters to me. You should know that it matters. It doesn't change. I know what it doesn't change," Elliot said. There was patience in his voice, the patience of someone who has had to explain difficult things in limited quantities of breath and has gotten very efficient about it. "I'm not telling you what it changes. I'm telling you what it is. It's a true thing that happened. You can decide what to do with it." Cord looked at this man in the bed, thin, careful, with the gray eyes that were his father's eyes and his sister's eyes, and felt something that he did not have a name for, which was perhaps simply the sensation of being seen without being judged, which is rarer and more disorienting than either of the alternatives. "Thank you," he said. It was not a sufficient thing to say, but it was true, and he had learned that true and insufficient was better than sufficient and false. Elliot nodded and closed his eyes, and Cord left the room quietly and went back to the yard to finish the fence post. On the morning of the fourth day, he was ready to leave. The horses were saddled. His gear was loaded. He stood in the yard in the early light, which was clear and cool and sharp in the way that spring mornings are sharp when the season has not yet committed to warmth. Wren came out of the house. She had a shawl around her shoulders against the morning chill, and her hair was down. He had not seen it fully down before, and it was longer than the knot had suggested, and in the early light it was darker, the red-brown, almost brown. She walked across the yard to where he stood by the horses and stopped in front of him. She looked at him for a moment without speaking. Then she said, "Elliot will need at least another month before he can be moved. I'm going to stay until he's well enough to travel. I know." And then she paused. "I don't know yet. I haven't decided. I know that too." She looked at him with the gray eyes that she had inherited from a man who had stood with open hands on a plateau in Texas and been answered with a bullet from a 22-year-old's rifle. And she looked at him without accusation and without forgiveness, because she was not a woman who confused those two things or offered either prematurely. "The bridge," she said. "What bridge?" "You told me. In Harlan Creek. The wooden bridge at the north edge of town that you've repaired 3 times. She held his gaze. "You said you didn't know how to build anything new, only repair. I remember. I think that was true when you said it." She reached into her pocket. "I'm not sure it's true anymore." She held out her hand. In her palm were 2 silver coins, old, their edges worn smooth, the faces of them soft with years of handling. He recognized them. He had seen them in her valise on the first day in a small cloth pouch that she had not explained. "These are my train fare from Pittsburgh," she said. "What I had left when I arrived in Harlan Creek." He looked at the coins and then at her. I know you're not owed anything," she said. "That's why I'm giving them to you." She set them in his hand, both coins, and folded his fingers around them. "You carried me 4 days through difficult country, and you walked into a room with Fletcher Doane, and you told me the truth before you had to, and you stayed when you didn't have to." She took her hand back. "And you split Elliot's firewood without being asked." He stood there with the coins in his hand. "Wren, don't tell me it doesn't matter," she said. "The fact that it doesn't settle anything is exactly why it matters." He looked at the coins. 2 pieces of silver worn smooth, the monetary value of them, almost nothing, the other value of them something he didn't have a word for. He put them in his breast pocket, the same pocket where he'd carried her first letter on the station platform in Harlan Creek. The letter he'd read so many times the words had stopped meaning what they used to mean. They were in the same pocket now. The letter and the coins in the pocket would carry them back to Harlan Creek. He picked up the reins of the gray horse. She stood in the yard with her shawl and her hair down, and the morning light behind her was the particular clear light of a day that intends to be honest with you. And he looked at her for a moment the way a man looks at a thing. He is trying to remember correctly, not to preserve it, but to understand it, to let it be what it actually was, rather than what he might make of it later. "There is a question I need to ask you," he said, "and you can answer it whenever you're ready or not answer it at all. Both are acceptable." She waited. "When you come back to Harlan Creek," he stopped, started again. "If you come back, I would like to know whether I should expect you." The question was not what it appeared to be on its surface, and she knew it was not, and he knew she knew it. It was not a question about logistics. She looked at him for a long moment. "Build the bridge first," she said. "A real one. New lumber, proper footings. Something that won't need repairing every 2 years because it was never built right to begin with." "That's not an answer." "It's the beginning of one," she said. He looked at her. She looked at him. Then he put his foot in the stirrup and mounted, and the gray horse shifted under him and settled, and he turned the horse toward the road. He did not look back before he turned the corner onto the main street of Grady Falls, because looking back requires a certainty about what you're leaving that he had not yet earned. But he carried the weight of the yard behind him. The morning light, the shawl, the hair down, the coins in his pocket, carried it the way you carry the true things, which is not as a burden but as a fact of yourself, something that has become part of the structure, rather than something resting on it. The road back to Harlan Creek was the same road he'd come on. But roads are not the same in both directions. The country looks different when you are returning to a thing than when you are leaving one, even if the thing you are returning to has not changed, and even if you cannot be certain of what you will find when you arrive. He rode west through the morning. By midday, the Reeves Flat was ahead of him, white and still and enormous, shimmering slightly in the heat that was beginning to build. He crossed it without hurrying, the gray horse picking its way with the same careful attentiveness it always brought to uncertain ground. On the far side, the country opened into the long brown roll of West Texas. The scrub and the dry washes and the sky that went on until it became something you couldn't look at directly. The road ran straight and pale into it. The kind of road that asks nothing of you except that you follow it. He followed it. 3 days later at dusk, he rode into Harlan Creek. Della Marsh was sitting on the porch of the boarding house in the last light, and she watched him come down the main street on the gray horse and said nothing until he tied up at the post. And then she said, "Elliot, sick but alive, thou." He said, "She's staying until he can travel." Della looked at him the way she looked at things she was deciding how much to say about. "And you," she said. "I'm gonna fix the bridge," he said. She looked at him for a moment longer. "The North Bridge." "Yes. It's been needing it for years." "I know." She nodded once and went back to whatever she'd been thinking before he came down the street. He went home. The house was the same. The kitchen was the same. The shelf between the salt box and the oil lamp had the notebook on it where it always was, where it would always be, the permanent record of a thing that could not be undone, only known, only carried, only answered for in the only ways that were still available. He took the 2 silver coins from his breast pocket and set them on the table. He looked at them in the last of the evening light coming through the window. Then he opened the notebook. He turned past the cramped and careful entries of the middle pages, past the date and the place, and the sentence written in diminishing hands 3 times over. He turned to the last page that had been written on, and then passed it to the first page that was still blank. He sat down at the table. He picked up his pen. He thought about a bridge, about what it meant to build something from the foundation, rather than to prop up what had been built badly before, about new lumber and proper footings and a structure that would not need repairing in 2 years, because it had been made right to begin with. He wrote the date at the top of the blank page. Then he sat for a moment with the pen, not because he didn't know what to write, but because he wanted to begin correctly. Outside, the cottonwoods along the creek had leafed out fully. Now it had happened while he was away, the slow daily accumulation of spring, finally arriving at its conclusion. Their leaves moved in the evening wind, catching the last light, turning it silver and green. The sound they made was the sound they always made, which was the sound of something alive doing the ordinary continuous work of being alive quietly without requiring anyone to notice. He put pen to paper. He began.